Welcome to Human Monsters. Joseph Paul Franklin was born James Clayton Vaughn on April 13th, 1950, in Mobile, Alabama. He had an older sister, Carolyn, a younger sister, Marilyn, and a younger brother, Gordon. Theirs was a dysfunctional household. Their father, James Sr., was an abusive alcoholic World War II veteran. Their mother, Helen, a German immigrant, was also an alcoholic and abusive in her own right. Neglect also factored into the mistreatment of the children. Both mother and father beat their children viciously. The selection of the latest victim depended on convenience for the parents and inconvenience for the child, i.e., whichever child happened to be around while either of the parents was having a bad day and wished to take it out on somebody. James Sr. would also beat his wife mercilessly. He would go on long drinking binges, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, coming home broke after drinking and pissing his paychecks away. According to Carolyn, following one of James's marathon drinking jags, he returned home, whereupon Helen demanded to know where he had been. She was pregnant at the time, and he beat her savagely for asking, to the point where he damaged the fetus and the infant was miscarried. However, James Jr. was the most frequent target of the abuse. Said Carolyn of the atmosphere in which she and her siblings grew up, "It was torture to live at home. It was pure hell. Wake up in the middle of the night, someone get you out of bed and just beat the hell out of you. We just have bad memories of my mother because she fussed a lot and hit a lot. My father, he had a cane. I know he hit Jimmy. He used to hit him with it all the time." In an interview, Franklin said that he was malnourished because his mother underfed him and his siblings. He described her as, quote, "so masculine and acted so much like a man." Franklin said that the malnutrition stunted his cognitive development somewhat. According to CEGH.com, the official website of clinical epidemiology and global health, malnutrition can indeed have adverse effects on a child's mental development. A quote from the website: "Many studies have shown that children exposed to severe acute malnutrition in early life have poor cognitive function, poor school achievement, and behavioral problems." Again, stunting and underweight are also reported to be associated with developmental delay. Carolyn said all the children suffered from mental disorders later on in life, though this could just as easily be chalked up to the complications of trauma due to the abuse. Gordon suffered from mental illness the most, having been committed as an inpatient to psychiatric hospitals on multiple occasions. One thing should be pointed out, however, and this is just as relevant to the siblings of other serial killers. James, later Joseph, was the only one of the children to become a serial killer, so he couldn't justifiably use his childhood experience of abuse as an excuse for being a murderer, since his siblings had an identical experience. Even Gordon, with all his mental health issues, never committed murder. Joseph's actions were his alone, and the accountability was all his. People who live in poverty tend to change address more often than denizens of the middle and upper classes. The Vaughns moved frequently throughout the eastern United States, living in many different urban centers. This was due to James Sr.'s alcoholism and lack of marketable job skills. He was pretty much useless beyond digging ditches and other unskilled labor. He would be unemployed for long periods of time, and they would move when he did find a job. It's not unusual for military families to change address frequently, but he was no longer serving, and they would move 3 or 4 times a year. As a result, the children never got to make lasting friendships. This can impact the mental and psychological development of a child. To quote the MacArthur Foundation, moving to a new home in childhood can impede school performance, social skills, and behavior, and the negative effects accumulate such that children who move multiple times are at greater risk. Moving has different effects at different ages, and changing schools adds to the stress. This is concerning given that many families, particularly low-income families, are frequently on the move. But before resettling everybody in his hometown of Mobile, Alabama, it was there that the children finally experienced some stability in their lives. Poverty was still an issue, however. The family lived in a housing project known as Birdville. The children attended the local public schools, which were gradually desegregated during the 1960s. That latter point was about to become relevant to James Jr. in a profound way. The civil rights movement was coming to a boil, and he lived smack dab in the middle of the Jim Crow South, so there was much chaos and upheaval around him. There was a great deal of violence as the racist whites in town resisted segregation by physically assaulting blacks and progressive Caucasians. He followed the exploits of the Freedom Riders in newspaper and television news reports as they were hauled out and beaten by members of the KKK, who led a hostile resistance against burgeoning social progress in 1961. James Jr. didn't involve himself in either side of the conflict as a participant, but he was deeply affected. As for the impact on him, the influence of these events were as pervasive as they were transformative, and the influence on his attitudes and beliefs were everlasting. For the time being, he had withdrawn into himself, a chrysalis that had yet to become the man who would be remembered as the notorious Joseph Paul Franklin. In the meantime, James Jr. showed some academic competence in school. He received good conduct marks and was generally reserved and well-behaved. He got along with other children, but usually preferred his own company. Keeping to oneself is often a habit taken up by victims of abuse. When James was alone, he wasn't abused. He came to associate people with the tortures he endured. Solitude offered peace, and under those circumstances, he could enjoy life for a change. Though he did well in elementary and middle school, James didn't do nearly as well in high school. He passed his classes, but was not inclined to study harder, though he was bright enough to do so. He had become rebellious to a degree that he began to run afoul of the teachers and the administration's policies. James decided to go the route of an autodidact. He became an avid reader. His book list did not reflect any of the recommendations of the English curriculum at school. He read the Bible from cover to cover. He read Adolf Hitler's memoir, Mein Kampf. These books he would count among the most impactful of any that he read, and he would cite certain passages as reinforcing his belief that his crimes were justified years later. He employed no critical thinking techniques while reading Mein Kampf. He believed every word and adopted Hitler's beliefs. Just like all the books of the Bible, every chapter of Mein Kampf would become the Gospels by which he oriented his way through life. The Bible was more esoteric, and his comrades in racism would provide their own vision of the Scriptures for him later as they nurtured his bigotry with their distorted interpretations. Is the Bible racist? Consider this quote, which is from Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Then again, in Genesis, you have the story of the Tower of Babel, in which people built a tower to take the express lane to heaven, which pissed God off royally. He punished all the racially homogeneous people by giving them different skin pigmentations and varied languages so they could not understand or relate to each other. It was apparently quite the culture shock, since it came about so suddenly. God gave racism and xenophobia to you, apparently. A quote from Mein Kampf. All the human culture, all the results of art, science, and technology that we see before us today are almost exclusively the product of the Aryan. If we were to divide mankind into three groups, the founders of culture, the bearers of culture, the destroyers of culture, only the Aryan could be considered as the representative of the first group. From him originate the foundations and walls of all human creation. Hence, it is no accident that the first cultures arose in places where the Aryan, in his encounters with lower peoples, subjected them and bent them to his will. As soon as these subjected people began to raise themselves up and probably approached the conqueror in language, the sharp dividing wall between master and servant fell. The Aryan gave up the purity of his blood and lost his cultural capacity until at last, not only mentally but also physically, he began to resemble the subjected aborigines more than his own ancestors. Such were the building blocks of the future Joseph Paul Franklin's ideology. Young James demonstrated symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder from a young age. According to his siblings, he was very fastidious about how the objects in his room were arranged. If anything was left astray, he would become angry. His compulsive insistence on order, attention to detail, and meticulous planning would be applied to his criminal activities years later. James had other pastimes beside reading. He was introduced to guns by an uncle who lived in Georgia, and he would shoot targets as a hobby. He was also fond of riding his bicycle. This pursuit played a pivotal role in his personal history, for at the age of 7, he had an accident while riding his bike. He took such a severe spill that he was left blinded in his right eye and partially blind in his left. The one silver lining of this acquired disability was it exempted him from being drafted into the war in Vietnam. He stated in an interview years later that the accident caused him to develop a cataract on one of his eyes. A doctor examined it and told him that removing the cataract would lead to double vision and that he would be better off leaving it as it was. He told James that if the eye had been treated shortly after the accident, his vision could have been saved. Franklin blamed his mother for not taking him to the doctor soon enough. Despite being legally blind, he remained a highly skilled marksman, even from long distances. When asked how he could hit his intended target from so far away with such poor vision, he chalked it up to practice. He said he, quote, can see well enough to shoot, you know. He continued to enjoy firearms throughout his teen years, but as satisfied as he was with the level of skill he developed in this area, it did not provide him with the kind of fulfillment that comes from personal relationships. Having decided that he could learn more on his own than in high school, James dropped out at the age of 16. Instead of looking for a job or learning a trade, James dedicated his time to his spiritual development. The New Age movement, with its ties to Eastern spirituality, had become very popular with America's youth. At one point, he even considered joining the Unification Church of the United States, a cult that would later be known as the Moonies. This was somewhat ironic since not only was this church opposed to racism, but the Moonies condoned and encouraged interracial marriages. Most likely, it was that latter aspect that drove him away from the faith. In the late 1960s, James was drawn to a sect of alternative Christianity called Christian Identity. One of the central tenets of their belief system is that modern-day members of the white race are descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They also believe that modern-day Jews are imposters and representatives of what they call the synagogues of Satan, which are mentioned in the New Testament's book of Revelation. As the Christian Identity sect saw it, non-white races, the black race in particular, represent what they call the beasts of the field, a term gleaned from the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. They don't see black people as true humans of God, claiming that they were made with the rest of the animals before the arrival of Adam and Eve. For James Vaughan, this was a godsend, no pun intended. The other reason the Christian Identity movement appealed to him was the fellowship. There was no real sense of love and family within his home, and he craved that connection. He craved a real sense of belonging. 1968, James Vaughan met one Bobby Louise Dorman, and apparently it was love at first sight, for they married 2 weeks later. Given the atmosphere of emotional neglect and hostility at home, Bobby could very well have been the first woman who ever loved him. They had a daughter soon after the marriage. James hadn't exactly seen an appropriate demonstration of matrimonial relations growing up, so when he began beating Bobby, he was passing the baton of abuse to the next generation. He was arrested multiple times for misdemeanor assault. The one way in which James did not emulate his father's example was when it came to alcoholism. James rarely took a drink and did not imbibe to excess. James soon realized he was not marriage and father material. He and Bobby were divorced less than a year after their wedding. He left town to begin a new life. It wasn't simply a matter of enjoying his freedom as a bachelor. He had something else in mind. He moved to Washington, D.C. to join the American Nazi Party. The pupa burst free from his cocoon and took flight, landing in Washington. He harbored a great deal of animosity towards racialized people, especially African Americans. With the combination of the ideas laid out in Mein Kampf and the Christian Identity literature, his worldview was colored by hate. As he saw it, integration was a conspiracy against America and the white race. He was a conspiracy theorist who believed that the federal government was a cabal of communists and Jews. He was ready to take a stand and both denounce the enemy and defend the tribe. The American Nazi Party was headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. It was not a large organization, as few Americans in the late 1960s would have wanted to embrace and be known as Nazis. Nevertheless, leader George Lincoln Rockwell was successful at attracting attention to the group through his demonstrations, flanked by the party faithful. They would clash with civil rights demonstrators, get into fights with left-wingers, and participate in debates and give speeches at universities. Rockwell was assassinated by one of his former followers in 1967. There was a great deal of tension within the group during its period of restructuring. James Vaughan arrived on the scene at this time. He was determined to make an impact in his own right and impress the leadership in any way he could. To his disappointment, he didn't fit in with the other members. It was mostly related to his outer disposition. His hair was long. He used the hippie parlance of the times as he spoke, using terms like man and dude. The Nazis hated hippies as much as they hated Jews, people of color, and communists. They also assumed he was a regular consumer of marijuana due to his ponderous manner of speaking. Despite the impression he gave at first glance, he was as straight edge as they were. Being a loner didn't help much, considering that fellowship and assembly were important elements of belonging to any political movement. 1969. James was determined to prove himself worthy of membership, and the opportunity presented itself that year. The anti-war movement was highly populated and reaching a fever pitch. It had become highly mobilized under the umbrella organization called the New Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. The Nazis discovered that the organization was scheduled to stage a major protest, which would include a march through the streets of Washington, D.C. The Nazis would have liked to lash out with violence against the massive throng, but they knew they would be outnumbered to the tune of at least 1,000 demonstrators per Nazi. Franklin had an idea of his own: launch a strike at the committee's office after the march begins. Surely anybody who believed in and supported their cause would not be at the office. They would want to be where the action was. As thousands of protesters marched, hoisting signs emblazoned with peace symbols and anti-war sentiments, James and his Nazi comrades raided the committee's office and planted smoke bombs. For the time being, the offices were not suitable for human habitation. Surely they would be cleaned up and repurposed for the cause, but the Nazis had made their point. James's initiative earned him respect among the party's membership, and he was elevated in rank, whereupon he was given more responsibilities. Though this was very satisfying to James, it was not enough to convince him to remain where he was. He grew up on the move, and it infected him with a wanderlust that would haunt him for the rest of his life, in and out of prison. Having achieved his goals with the Nazis, he packed his bags and hit the road. James Vaughn settled in Atlanta, Georgia. In the early 1970s, Atlanta was embroiled in racial tension like so many other cities in the South. Many of Atlanta's white citizens moved to the suburbs, a phenomenon referred to as white flight. Another practice symbolic of the process of segregation was what was referred to as busing, which consisted of transporting African American children to schools in other districts to accelerate the process of desegregation in the education system. This procedure was unpopular with both blacks and whites. Whites hated that the government was forcing integration on them, and African Americans were displeased that their children had to endure long bus rides, not to mention racist bullying, which often involved brute physical violence. This is from an appearance by comedian Chris Rock on Neil Brennan's podcast, How Neil Feel, in which he described his experience being bused to a white school where he was one of only 4 black children.
What now? At Chris's school in 1975, this is the first year, but you were in the first year of busing, correct?
I was bused. Let's see. Okay, I'm born in 65, so in 75 I'm 10. See how long it took me to realize that?
It's that learning disability.
That's that learning disability. I've literally had to count it. So I'm 75 and 10, so I would say in
What's funny is that you're born in 65.
Dr. King's alive.
Yes. That's the thing of like how much, like the Voting Rights Act.
The Voting Rights Act doesn't happen until 68. So I'm born, my parents can't vote.
Wow.
I mean, they can, but it's
dicey.
they're going to get, like, as you pointed out a few weeks ago, like they're going to get probably fucked up.
Yeah,
at the polls.
Yeah, they're gonna get their ass kicked.
But that what's important about that is not that Martin Luther King was so long ago. It's that it was so recent. It's not
Yes.
that you're so old. It's that wasn't that long ago.
Oh, no. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, his parents. You're the oldest,
I'm the oldest of my mother's kids. Yeah.
so could not vote. Did they vote the first year?
I have no idea.
Yeah,
I have no. You know.
they didn't like make it.
I mean, they eventually voted, but yeah, I don't. You know.
Fantastic. Okay, now Chris's bus is one of the first years of busing.
Okay.
Now,
So
when
about 73, 72, 73.
72, 73, when the black kid, there were how many black, like 10% of the school was black?
No. It was me PS277 was me and three black girls.
Out of
I don't know, it was at a school.
800, 1,000?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
It's 4 kids out of that. So you would get, when the bell would ring,
Yeah.
everyone would,
Oh, that grade school was like my first days of grade school. I remember like, you know, there was like parents outside with like signs, no busing,
Oh my God.
niggas go home, whatever, right? That was grade school.
Shitty.
And it was, you know, it was hostile and kids would call
Yeah.
you nigger and spit on you and throw
regular stuff.
bags of shit and piss at you for the holidays. But
For the holidays.
I'm getting gassed
for the
at
holidays,
school.
you know, occasional teachers would call you a monkey or whatever.
Yeah,
But,
please. That's the story I'm trying to get to.
Like teachers would
Explain these
just
stories.
say-
Neil's going somewhere.
teachers would tell you shit under your breath. The janitors or
bell
whatever.
would ring at 3 in high school or late
One
grade
time or a couple of times. I just remember, yeah, because we used to get out early, like they would let us out at 2:45.
They let the black kids out early so they
For
wouldn't
safety?
get beat up.
Yeah, dude, kind of like get that over with because you don't want to just. It's easier to watch you. So we get out at
It's in
2:45.
the 1700s.
Yeah, and there was so I remember one of my teachers. Time to let the animals free or some.
Time
shit
to
like
let the animals free.
that.
And then the janitor said something you said. Something awful.
Savages or something. I don't know.
Yeah, just
man.
Wow.
awful.
It's just-
So
yeah,
everyone's against you. Just everyone.
I mean,
in
it
this
wasn't
school is
even
against
me. It was like
You and 4 other people.
it was just whatever.
that were just against black people.
Yeah, it was just they probably didn't know my name.
Insane.
Yeah.
And have you in therapy and all the shit you're doing, are you acknowledging that how crazy that is?
Yeah, it's weird. I've always been able to tell jokes about it, but yeah, now in therapy, I'm allowed to, you know, experience it as trauma.
Yeah.
You can say,
And not feel like a bitch. Feel like
and
no,
not
I
feel
did-
like a bitch, and yeah,
and like I should. That's a fine thing to acknowledge that happened.
it's a fine thing to acknowledge, and it's also, you know, the thing about trauma is when you experience trauma, it's not that you. It's basically whenever you think about it like it's happening for the first time.
Yeah, your body doesn't know when. It doesn't know if it's present, past, or future.
Right.
Yes.
So, yeah, therapy's allowed me to put it in the past. Like, therapy's allowed me to go, okay, I'm probably not going to get jumped today.
James Vaughn wanted to exploit this situation and decided the best way to go about it was to join the National States' Rights Party. The leader was the brash and unapologetic segregationist J.B. Stoner. Stoner met and got to know James. He soon identified potential in him and appointed him to the position of lead propagandist. Duties included handing out newspapers and leaflets on the streets of Atlanta. By the mid-1970s, James became disillusioned by the movement. They had done their utmost to spread the message of white power to the masses, but the general white populace was just not as receptive as they once were. Few passers-by accepted the literature, and some would even stop to argue with him. James did not give up on his mission, and he decided that the next step was to become radicalized. Radical to the point where he concluded that the only way to get his point across was through violence. No fistfights with protesters, no bombings of empty campaign offices. It was his inference, based on his odious reasoning, that people had to die. When the epitaph is written in blood, people read it cover to cover. James was on the move again, this time to Alabama. His objective was to enlist in the United Klans of America. They spelled Klan with a K. It was often referred to as the so-called Third Era of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan's business was unfinished, evidenced by the fact that their last recorded lynching was in 1978. The Third Klan was comprised of a network of independent chapters spread out across America. They emerged during the 1950s in response to the burgeoning civil rights movement. The United Klans of America were cited as being the most militant and effective organizations of its kind in the country. The UKA were known for resorting to violence in getting their message across, and this was right up James's alley. Marching in sheets and burning crosses was not enough for him. It was important ritually and symbolically, but he wanted the desegregating world to know that he meant business. He wanted to strike fear in the general population. He wanted them to pay for their efforts to establish a colorblind society. He wanted to learn militaristic combat skills so he could carry out his one-man race war against those factions of the American population he felt needed to be purged. Without a gun in his hand, his voice was muted. He wanted to lay the groundwork for a legacy of earaches and echoes that would reverberate amid the advent of the generations to come. In 1976, James was in rural Alabama at a UKA compound undergoing his combat education. It was in 1976 that James Vaughn legally changed his name to Joseph Paul Franklin. The name is an amalgam of his favorite historical figures: Joseph Paul Goebbels, the minister of propaganda in Nazi Germany, and Franklin in tribute to President Benjamin Franklin, seen by Joseph as the greatest American in history. Though Joseph Paul Franklin was bright and articulate, he was not an intellectual in approach or design. He saw himself as a soldier, rather than a politician or intellectual. He would convey his message in bullets. He felt violence was acceptable as a means of political protest because he was at war. As he said in an interview years later, "I saw violence as the only way to accomplish things. I still believe that violence is good if it's directed toward the right people." During his time training with the UKA, he not only upgraded his knowledge and skills with firearms, he also became an expert in demolition, familiarizing himself with explosives and their manufacture. Years after being rejected by the draft due to his poor eyesight, he was accepted into the Alabama National Guard in 1977. During his time with the Guard, he further upgraded his marksmanship and learned the basics of field medicine and first aid. What he didn't care for was the rigid structure and discipline that was standard for life in the Guard. He was a nonconformist by nature and only joined to acquire more guerrilla war skills. His goal was to become a one-man army. After a couple of months, he left the Guard to launch his battle. Regarding his race war, he had this to say in an interview from prison years later. "Yeah, I wanted to start a race war, you know. I got the idea from Charles Manson, hoping that other white supremacists would see what I was doing and say, 'Hey, look, let's go do it too.'" Franklin was done with the ceremonies and the masquerades. It was showtime. He wanted to dish out the consequences to the people he felt were ruining America. He wanted to take up his guns and bombs and strike out against his enemies. Jews, blacks, whites who socialized with, mated, and married interracially, with whites who did so with blacks in particular. They hadn't sought Joseph Saul Franklin's permission to do so. Not that it would have been granted. Until 1976, he only assaulted them verbally. Declaring war was only the first step. He decided it was now time to start producing casualties. Whenever he would see an interracial couple in public, especially a black man with a white woman, he would confront them and berate them for race mixing. It didn't matter where the confrontation took place. A shopping mall, a restaurant, a parking lot, it mattered not. He also didn't care how people reacted or felt about it, and that included the couple. Given that he was poised for violence, he was likely prepared to engage anybody in fisticuffs, should the occasion have called for it. Disappointed or not, these conflicts never advanced to the level of physical violence. 1976 was the year when verbal and figurative violence etched John Paul Franklin's message of racial intolerance into the flesh. He felt his victims owed a debt to him for stripping his homeland of the place it had once been, and they paid him in the currency of flesh and blood. One night he was driving the streets in the Maryland suburbs of Washington. His commute came to a halt when he found himself in a traffic-related dispute with another motorist. His displeasure soon escalated into road rage. When he rolled down his window to give the other motorist a tongue lashing, he discovered that the driver was a black man and the passenger was a white woman. Franklin followed the couple to a cul-de-sac. When they came to a stop, he got out of his car as they departed from theirs. He shouted some racial slurs at the black man and sprayed them both with mace. He was arrested for the incident, but he was never prosecuted because he didn't show up for the court hearings. Upon his realization that he couldn't wage his one-man race war behind bars, he left town before the police could arrest him for failing to appear. Franklin took steps to ensure that he would never get caught during his killing spree. For one thing, he saved up a considerable amount of money so that he would not have to work or beg. Under those circumstances, social interaction would be inevitable, and he knew that the more he integrated with people, the more likely somebody would recognize him from a wanted poster. As time would tell, he avoided being arrested for 3 years. His were not crimes of opportunity. He was methodical and covered every contingency possible. It was like a chess game, and both his victims and the police were his opponents. He had to anticipate their future moves. His paramilitary experience became an asset when it came to strategy. One of his many skill sets that kept the law off his back was his aptitude for creating false identities and their corresponding documents. Getting a driver's license was much easier in the late 1970s because databases were not as centralized as they are now. Franklin would go to a county courthouse in whichever city he targeted for his domestic terrorism agenda and claim that he misplaced his driver's license. A clerk would issue him a few forms to fill out, and he would be provided with a duplicate of his license. He would go through this process dozens of times. He would also alter his appearance. If someone witnessed one of his crimes, he would cut or dye his hair. When he explored a neighborhood populated predominantly by people of color, he would wear an afro and brown foundation makeup. He would wear hats and different frames for his prescription glasses. He was careful about his use of automobiles. He paid for cars in cash and never transferred titles. He kept a collection of license plates that he used when appropriate for the state in which he was situated. He would park the cars at a considerable distance from the crime scene so that witnesses would not see him. He would often ride a bicycle from the car to the spot that became a crime scene. Bicycles are not especially useful in police investigations, and he stole them, which made them even more useless in that regard. He was well equipped and prepared strategically. The soldier was ready for battle. Summer 1977. John Paul Franklin now felt he was ready for his race war to begin. He was armed to the teeth with guns and ammunition and was equipped to shake the earth with his bombs. As you can imagine, he was not at all thrilled by the election of Democrat Jimmy Carter to the office of president. Franklin sent him a letter in which he used threatening language because of his support of the civil rights movement. Naturally, the letter never made it to the Oval Office. Though Joseph Paul Franklin hated blacks with a vengeance, it was his anti-Semitism that fueled his rage. He considered blacks to be inferior and subhuman, but he was compassionate enough to see these characteristics as accidents of birth. He saw Jews as evil to the core and responsible for most of the problems that plagued the world. His perception of Jews was a hybrid of the Christian identity movement's ethos and his own perspective. He watched in horror as young Jewish university students migrated to the South during the 1960s to help register African Americans to vote after the then recently enacted civil rights legislation was passed. He was also cognizant that they were heavily represented among the anti-war contingent, which also aroused his indignation. He felt the Jews were untrustworthy, and as such, they were vermin. As he saw it, he was the exterminator America needed. Few would have viewed him as a hero for what he had in mind, but he was happy to mete out the tough love he felt America needed as part of an initiative to restore it to the nation in which he was raised during the 1950s. Franklin fantasized about killing Jews in large numbers, like a one-man Holocaust. Joking about this years later, he said, "I could just sit there with a rifle and pick off Jews. I could get a whole lot of Jews at one time." In the summer of 1977, Franklin began perusing print media for prominent Jewish people to target for assassination. He pored through newspapers, magazines, and books as if they were catalogs advertising victims for sale. One figure stood out, Morris Amity. He was a congressional lobbyist for Israel. Franklin decided to strike Amity at his house. Considering this was decades before one could find a politician's address online, he had his work cut out for him. He did find his address after an exhaustive search. Amity lived in a suburb of D.C. Franklin drove to the address to get a sense of its layout and the surrounding neighborhood. His plan was to blow the house up. He purchased 50 pounds of dynamite using a forged driver's license when asked for ID. He built the bomb in a hotel room. July 25, 1977. Early that morning, Franklin pulled up by the Amity house. Undetected, he placed the bomb beneath the house, set the charge, and departed. The explosion was huge and damaging, but while the house was destroyed, there were no human casualties. Only the family's dog perished in the blast. Because a political representative of the federal government was targeted, the FBI and the ATF were called in to investigate. They found what remained of the bomb, but none of the materials retrieved could be traced to a suspect. They did presume that due to his Jewish ethnicity and high-profile ties to Israel, that he was either targeted for hate crime by neo-Nazi types or by Middle Eastern extremists. Either way, it was presumed that it was a terrorist attack, foreign or domestic. Groups like the Palestine Liberation Organization and Black September had been targeting prominent Jewish figures for violence throughout the 1970s. 30 years after World War II, the world was still not a safe place for Jews, especially their elected officials. Amid this investigation, Franklin was eating asphalt en route to the site of his next attack. He was deeply disappointed that the Amity bombing didn't yield any human casualties. To think that the only blood that was spilled was from a hapless canine. The failure was hard to bear. He was more hell-bent than ever to carry out attacks. He would not stop until he left a trail of corpses behind. After a lengthy drive, Joseph Franklin came to rest in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Though there was not a large Jewish population in Chattanooga, the city did feature a few synagogues, including the Beth Shalom Orthodox Temple. After checking into a motel under a pseudonym, Franklin sat down with a copy of the local Yellow Pages and looked for a synagogue to bomb. This time around, he wanted to ensure that more would result from the attack than property damage. He wanted as many casualties as possible, and that meant he had to bomb the place during a service. He decided on the Beth Shalom Temple because it was located conveniently by the freeway, meaning that he could make a fast and easy getaway. Throughout his career as a serial killer, he generally favored kill spots that were situated close to major traffic arteries so he could escape with minimal fuss. July 29, 1977. In the evening, Joseph Franklin planted the bomb inside the Beth Shalom synagogue. He programmed the bomb to detonate while the congregants were still in the building. They had already said their prayers by the time the bomb detonated. The synagogue sustained a considerable amount of damage, but no one was injured or killed. Franklin had already taken to the road. Joseph was frustrated. 2 bombings and 0 human casualties. He realized that to kill people, he would have to alter his methods. He would have to retool. The tool would be a firearm. He gathered some guns and ammo and drove to Wisconsin in search of victims. Along the way, Franklin was reading a newspaper when one article triggered his rage. A judge in Madison, Wisconsin, by the name of Archie Simonson, recently showed leniency to 2 African-American juvenile offenders who were convicted for raping a white girl. As if this turn of events hadn't enraged him enough, he really blew his stack when he found out the judge was Jewish. He decided on his new target. He loaded up his car with phony driver's licenses, disguises, guns, and ammo. Soon he was northward bound. August 7th, 1977. Joseph Franklin arrived in Madison. Before launching his attack on Judge Simonson's residence, he decided to examine his routine through surveillance. In the meantime, Franklin went to a shopping mall to get some supplies before heading back to Simonson's house. As he departed the parking lot, he was blocked by another car. Normally, this would not have been a big deal, but the occupants of the other car were an interracial couple, a black man and a white woman. The black man shouted some expletives at Franklin, who retorted with racial slurs. He also insulted the woman for her racial disloyalty. According to Franklin, the man saw a rifle that was riding shotgun in his car. Franklin struck preemptively by drawing a pistol and shooting the man. The woman screamed. Franklin got out of his car and walked over to theirs. He shot the woman twice, and whether due to the first shot or second, she was killed instantly. Killing impulsively like this in broad daylight in a location so densely populated was at variance with his highly organized murder methods, but sometimes his racist rage got the better of him. Ultimately, he derived a great deal of satisfaction from murdering mixed-race couples. He decided that it was important to kill the male first, as that way he could eliminate most of the obstacles first. As he remarked years later, if you shoot the black man first, the woman would just stay by his side like a dumb fucking idiot. It's the funniest thing. It happened every time. Judge Simonson literally and unknowingly dodged a bullet as Franklin left Madison to avoid being arrested for murdering the interracial couple. Like most serial killers, Joseph Franklin had a so-called cooling-off period. He spent this time migrating throughout the southern states. He robbed banks and bought and sold firearms. Amid all this activity, the desire to carry out his race war remained, and his desire to bring it to fruition was reaching a fever pitch more than ever. September 1977. Franklin bought a Remington 30.6 rifle from a classified ad. It was the exact kind of gun he preferred to use. It was precise, powerful, and American-made. He drove to Oklahoma City. October 1977. In his quest to kill Jews, Franklin was exacting. He wanted the ideal location, the perfect amount of victims, and readily accessible escape routes. He took to the road and traveled northward. Within 2 days, Franklin entered the St. Louis area. It was a place where he could pick off some Jews, as he put it. After renting a motel room, he cracked open the Yellow Pages and searched for synagogues. He undertook the process of choosing a target. He promised himself he would not fail this time. He decided on Brith Shalom Knesset Israel Congregation in Richmond Heights, Missouri. He chose this synagogue because of its hiding places, vantage point, and the multiple entrance-exit points. He would make sure this time that he struck in the middle of services. October 7th. At night, Franklin went to Brith Shalom to prepare for the attack, which would be carried out the following night. He parked his car down the street and snuck up behind some bushes. This gave him a bird's-eye view of the synagogue. He carried his rifle in a guitar case. He stashed the case in the bushes. He hammered 2 nails into a telephone pole, which he would use as a gun rest. He returned to his motel room to get a full night of shut-eye. He wanted to rest up for what promised to be a big day, among the most momentous of his life. October 8th, Franklin double-checked to make sure services would be held at Brith Shalom that evening. Everything was expected to proceed as scheduled. He rode a stolen bike to the spot where he kept his rifle. Shortly after the services finished, men and women began to file out the front door. Franklin aimed his rifle at the people and began firing. His years of target practice paid off. He air-holed 3 men who lay on the ground bleeding profusely. By the time police arrived at the synagogue, Franklin was already in his motel room. He was channel surfing, desperate to find local news coverage of the shooting. He had an appetite for notoriety, and it was soon satiated as the story began to emerge as news updates. Of the 3 victims who were hit, only one, Gerald Gordon, died. The FBI were called in to assist the local police because the attack was suspected to be a hate crime. Franklin hoped that the media coverage would inspire others with his beliefs to take up arms and carry out attacks of their own. Still, he was surprised by the level of media focus the incident attracted. Franklin loaded his personal effects into the latest car and drove southward down I-55 toward Memphis. Thus began his next cooling off period. As he drove, he decided his next victim had to be a celebrity. That celebrity was pornographer Larry Flynt. He didn't target Flynt just because of his pornographic magazine Hustler. Yes, it was less tasteful than Hugh Hefner's Playboy. Hustler featured considerably more glistening. What Joseph Franklin objected to when he opened up a copy of Hustler for the first time was a spread in which a black man was shown having sex with a white woman. Said Franklin of this experience, "It just showed a black male and a white female together. And when I closed the magazine up, I just thought to myself, I'm going to kill Flynt." He has said that publications like Playboy and Penthouse never bothered him. It was the images of blacks and whites coexisting as, in Shakespeare's parlance, the beast with two backs. Because of this, he decided that Larry Flynt was a sick degenerate who deserved to die. Others might have drawn that conclusion from the magazine's comic strip Chester the Molester, which depicted child sexual abuse in a satirical context. He found out Flynt was staying in Lawrenceville, Georgia, while fighting obscenity charges. Franklin had spent much time in Atlanta, robbing banks and rubbing elbows with the National States Rights Party. He felt right at home there. He described how he went about seeking out Larry Flynt. "I checked into another motel and then started going out there every day, looking around over in Lawrenceville at the courthouse there, looking to ambush him." He soon learned that Flynt and his lawyer Gene Reeves ate at a diner located just down the street from the courthouse. Franklin searched the surrounding area for a potential sniper's nest. It was difficult in that there was no wooded area behind which he could obscure himself. However, he didn't have to search much longer. He found an abandoned building located directly across the street from the diner. He made his way to the roof, where he set up his sniper's nest. As Flynt and Reeves got settled into their seats in the diner, Franklin arranged his .44 caliber rifle. He also psychologically prepared himself. Flynt and Reeves departed from the diner unaware that they were walking within the crosshairs of Franklin's rifle's scope. He opened fire, landing a few shots on Flynt, most notably on his stomach. He landed one shot on Reeves' arm, which ricocheted and pierced his torso. Flynt fell to the sidewalk. Reeves ran down the street. Onlookers ran every which way, but nobody looked up at Franklin. Franklin sped away in his getaway car. After driving some distance down an interstate highway, he stopped at a payphone and placed a call to the Gwinnett County Courthouse, where Larry Flynt's trial was being held that day. He told the secretary who answered, "Tell Solicitor Gary Davis he doesn't have to worry about Larry Flynt anymore. Jesus has taken a hand in it." Fortunately for Franklin, there were no witnesses who had observed him as the shooter. His strategy paid off. As he put it years later, everybody's too busy watching the person fall down. With all witnesses focused on the victim, there was no spotlight on the assassin. Ironically, Larry Flynt normally traveled with security guards, but he felt safe in Georgia. It was this attack that left Flynt physically immobile with a speech impediment for the rest of his life. Defiant as ever, he continued to feature interracial pictorials in Hustler. Franklin was frustrated that he didn't finish Flynt off. He wanted to roll Flynt in his golden wheelchair straight through the gates of hell. To quote Franklin from an interview years later, "I became upset and went to the hospital and started driving around the parking lot, thinking maybe I could finish him off that way. Eventually, he gave up on this idea and drove away. Another cooling off period followed for a few months. Franklin drove around the South aimlessly. He robbed banks. He visited friends. At one point, his desire to resume his race war would no longer be denied. July 19th, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Joseph Franklin was on the hunt for mixed-race couples. Normally, he hated seeing the sight of them, but now he was disappointed because he was so eager to wipe them out, and they were nowhere to be seen. He was about to give up when he drove by a Pizza Hut and spotted a black man sitting across the table from a white woman. Franklin drove to a spot around the corner from the restaurant. Franklin pulled a 12-gauge shotgun from the trunk of his car. He positioned himself behind some bushes along the edge of the Pizza Hut parking lot. He waited for them to depart from the restaurant and approach their car. As the couple drew near to their car, Franklin jumped up and fired 2 shots in their direction. He killed the man instantly. He injured the woman, but she did not die right away. As they lay on the pavement bleeding out, Franklin fled. July 29th, 1979. Franklin shot and killed the black manager of a Taco Bell in suburban Atlanta because he felt he was working too closely with white female employees. August 8th, 1979. Joseph Franklin shot and killed from a long distance a black man who was eating in a Burger King. Though Joseph Paul Franklin's heart was blackened by hate, there was a crack wide enough to admit the light of love, for he still desired female companionship, and not just the kind he got from the prostitutes he hired on occasion. In January 1979, he met and married a woman from Alabama named Anita Carden. She was aware that he was not just a garden variety racist, but a militant one. She wasn't aware that his bigotry manifested as homicide, however. She didn't know his real name either. The name she knew him by was James Cooper. He told her he was a plumber and that it was the reason he was constantly traveling. He would tell her he was going on business trips. Meanwhile, he was robbing banks and murdering interracial couples and blacks. Anita and James first lived in Montgomery, Alabama, and then moved to Mobile. This marriage didn't differ much from his first. They had 1 daughter, and he was gone most of the time. When he was home, he abused Anita. May 2nd, 1980. Joseph Paul Franklin was in Wisconsin. He picked up a white female hitchhiker named Rebecca Bergstrom. She was heading from Madison to Frederick, Wisconsin. They got to talking, and at some point, Franklin told her about his race-related views. He asked her for her feedback. She told him she once dated a black man. Not exactly the feedback he was hoping for. Franklin pulled the car over to the side of the road in Tomah, Wisconsin. He ordered Bergstrom to get out of the car. He shot her with a pistol and left her there without any effort to conceal her remains. Since he didn't rape or beat her, no DNA evidence was left behind that could incriminate him. Local law enforcement was unable to find a suspect before his confession. June 26, 1980. Joseph Franklin was in West Virginia. He had robbed a bank in North Carolina and was anxious to flee the state before investigators could draw a line from the scene of the crime to his motel doorstep. He pulled over to pick up 2 female hippies, 19-year-old Nancy Santamero and 26-year-old Vicky Durian. He hoped he could get some sex out of it, most ideally with both, but one of them would have sufficed. The girls were indeed hippies. They were members of the Rainbow Gathering subculture. This was not just about smoking dope and wearing flowers in one's hair. They adopted the philosophy and politics and were living the lifestyle. Rainbow gatherings took place in rural areas where they took in music and consumed illicit substances. They were like Woodstock, but on a smaller scale. The girls were headed to the next rainbow gathering, and unfortunately for them, Joseph Franklin picked them up as they hitchhiked. As he drove, the subject of race, and more specifically, interracial dating, became a fixture of conversation. One of the women confessed to having once dated a black man, while the other stated that she didn't have any opposition to the practice. Franklin drove them down a back road that seldom got much traffic. It didn't take the girls long to figure out that they were not headed toward the rainbow gathering site. When they asked him what he was up to, he said, "Get out, I'm fixing to rape you." He stated years later that he had no intention of raping them, that he only wanted to get them out of the car so that they wouldn't leave any of their blood on the car's upholstery. The women refused to leave the car, so he shot both. He dumped their corpses on the side of the road and drove to the next city, where he cleaned the upholstery and sold the car. A man named Jacob Beard was arrested and convicted for the murders in 1993. He was exonerated following Joseph Franklin's confession years later. Joseph Franklin decided to assassinate another public figure, this time Vernon Jordan. When asked years later why he targeted famous people, he said, "It was just something to me that it meant to me that I was able to beat the system." Vernon Jordan was a lawyer, civil rights activist, and executive director of the United Negro College Fund, so it's not difficult to see why someone like Joseph Paul Franklin would reserve a bullet for him. May 29th, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Joseph Franklin wanted to assassinate Jesse Jackson, but when he arrived, he found out he was out of town. He was enraged by this, but decided to reroute that anger to Vernon Jordan, who was in Fort Wayne, dealing with business related to the National Urban League, a civil rights and urban advocacy organization that seeks protections and justice for African Americans against racial discrimination. After reading some local newspapers, Franklin learned that Jordan was staying at the Fort Wayne Marriott. He put on one of his disguises and drove to the hotel. After searching the lobby, Franklin found Jordan surrounded by a small crowd. The people were white, among them many females, which made Franklin's blood boil. After following Jordan for a while, he found out which room he was staying in and got a sense of what his schedule was like. Franklin discovered that Jordan's room overlooked the parking lot. It would only be a matter of finding a good place to set up a sniper's nest. He could park his car nearby, so there would be no necessity for a bicycle this time. En route to a white woman's house for coffee, Vernon Jordan was walking down the street with his companion when a couple of white men shouted some racial epithets at them from a passing car. Jordan and his consort were shaken for a time, but they put it behind them. May 30th, 2 a.m., Vernon Jordan's companion drove him back to his hotel. As soon as Franklin caught sight of Jordan exiting the car, he fired at him from a .30.06 rifle, landing a hit in his back. Jordan fell to the pavement. Franklin didn't shoot the white woman. He gathered his belongings, put them in his car, and drove straight out of Fort Wayne. As he drove beyond the Fort Wayne city limits, he became convinced that he had to do more to bring about his race war. Vernon Jordan's back was shattered into several pieces, necessitating multiple surgeries and a prolonged convalescence in hospital, but he eventually recovered. The men who verbally abused Jordan and his companion were questioned but not found to be culpable. The black community was convinced the shooting was racially motivated, while the police was not. Such was an embodiment of how divided the black and law enforcement communities were. Franklin confessed to the shooting years later, but he was acquitted in a federal civil rights trial because jurors felt there was a dearth of evidence. Joseph Franklin was deeply disappointed that his racially motivated attacks were not receiving more media focus. As he put it, "I was just getting very upset because the news media, the national news media, wasn't covering what I was doing. They were pretty well suppressing the news. I don't know, I guess they were afraid they'd start a race war or something, and that's what I was trying to do. I just decided to just turn up the heat a little bit." Joseph Franklin drove from city to city to city until he settled in Cincinnati. He was looking for victims. He didn't choose a black neighborhood because he felt there would be too many witnesses who would notice and remember him. After all, a bona fide African American wouldn't have trouble distinguishing one of their own kind from a white guy wearing a fake afro and brown makeup on his face. Franklin discovered the Bond Street neighborhood, which was racially mixed. He found a spot on a roof to set up a sniper's nest and target some mixed-race couples. Once he was satisfied with the setup, he went back to his motel room to get a good night's sleep. June 8, 1980. Joseph Franklin was headed to the sniper's nest. Along the way, he hit on a woman he met at a convenience store, which was mistake number one. If she ever became aware he was a suspect of the crime, she could place him at the scene. Nevertheless, he returned to the sniper's nest. As he put it, "I was just waiting. I was sitting on that railroad track waiting for the first, either interracial couple or black to walk by." 11:30 p.m. Two black men were walking by. He shot at one of them. The other made his escape. Franklin commented on how it went down. "I hit the first one first with the rifle. I hit the taller one first, and the second one bolted immediately. I had no time to take the crosshairs on him, a moving target like that, so I just swung the rifle to the left and fired a shot where I thought he might be, and incredibly it hit him. I could not believe it. When I saw in the papers they must be lying, because I could not have hit that second man." He shot at minors, 13-year-old Dante Brown and his 14-year-old cousin, Darrell Lane. They both perished that evening. He made another mistake before leaving the Cincinnati area. He placed an ad in a local newspaper to sell a guitar and amplifier. The woman who responded went to his motel room to make the transaction. He tried to sell her one of his guns, but she declined. She found him sketchy and wrote his license plate number down after she left. This information would be integral to his arrest. The next town Franklin settled in was Jonestown, Pennsylvania, where he checked into a motel under a pseudonym. After getting settled in his room, he opened up the Yellow Pages to find victims. June 15th. John Franklin set up his sniper's nest on a bridge near the Conmouth River. He waited patiently for the right human targets to come along. At some point, a black man and white woman came walking in the same direction. At first, he wasn't sure if they were a couple or if they knew each other at all. When they held hands, it was more than he could take. He shot at them until they were both dead. He packed his artillery into his car and drove westward. August 13th, 1980. John Franklin settled in Salt Lake City. One thing that leads to many serial killers getting caught is carelessness. They get cocky after a long run of literally getting away with murder, and they blithely assume the paradigm will continue unabated. And so was Franklin's assumption at this time. He checked into a motel under a pseudonym, but one precaution he forgot to take was changing the license plate on his car. They were the same plates he used during the Bond Hill murders. One of the motel's owners recalled the license plate numbers in question. It took several days for Franklin to find the kind of victims he was looking for. Salt Lake City has traditionally been a predominantly white city, so black people and mixed-race couples would not only be hard to find, but they would be surrounded mostly by whites as witnesses. In the meantime, he decided upon some female companionship. It is a very religious city, so it was no epicenter of adult entertainment. He decided to arrange for the services of a call girl to make it speedy and convenient. He met a prostitute named Mickey, and they came to an arrangement that suited them both. He discussed his racial beliefs with her. He also asked her if she knew or knew of black pimps in the area and where he could locate black-white couples. Mickey's pimp was black, and Franklin offered to kill him. He bragged about killing several blacks as a hitman for the Ku Klux Klan. On another occasion, Franklin picked up 2 Caucasian hitchhikers. He bragged to them about murdering blacks. These girls and Mickey would report him to the police after his crimes came to light, and he was cited as the prime suspect. Franklin soon learned that the neighborhood known as Liberty Park was known for its racial mix. No other neighborhood in Salt Lake City was more likely to feature black people and mixed-race couples, so it was there where he would set up his new sniper's nest. August 20th, 1980. Joseph Franklin set up his sniper's nest behind a row of bushes in Liberty Park. He waited patiently for the right prey to come along. Without waiting long, Franklin spotted 2 mixed-race couples walking together. He put his crosshairs on one black man and shot him. At first, the other 3 didn't realize what was happening, but then the 2 women saw the man dead on the ground and fled from the scene. The other black man tried to help his friend. Franklin shot him. Both men died from their injuries instantly. At this time, one form of technology used by American police was teletype. When investigators in one city drew a blank while searching for a suspect, they could send out a request to other agencies across the country in hopes that the crime in question might bear a resemblance to others that had been committed elsewhere. Police in Cincinnati recognized some details in an unsolved homicide case they had been working on. Detectives of the Cincinnati Police Department and a few FBI agents flew out to Salt Lake City to meet with the local police department to discuss the details of the case. As a result, progress accelerated. They spoke with witnesses who saw a sketchy-looking white man driving around the area shortly before the shootings took place. They spoke with Mickey and got a description from her. They also interviewed eyewitnesses who saw the shootings in Liberty Park. A composite sketch of the suspect was coming together. They had a face. Now they would need a name. Now they had to wait for the murderer to make another sloppy mistake. His mistake was returning to Cincinnati, where the law was hot on his trail. They tracked his car to the hotel where he had checked in. They blocked his car in the parking lot, so he was unable to leave. He complained to the front desk clerk by telephone, but they did nothing. Incredibly, he had the hubris to call the police department in Florence, Kentucky, to complain about it. At the time, Cincinnati police were at the motel to arrest a robbery suspect. When they received a message from the dispatcher about Franklin's complaint, they ran the license plate on his Camaro through the system and found out they were linked to 2 murders. He was arrested in his motel room. Though police initially followed procedure as Franklin was arrested and brought in for interrogation, one officer decided to uncuff him. It was a small town police department and unaccustomed to dealing with serial killers, as resourceful and cunning as Joseph Paul Franklin. Leaving him out of handcuffs was all it would take for him to escape. As Franklin put it years later, I was handcuffed to a chair. I prayed to the Lord. An hour later, this blond guy took the handcuffs off and left the room. I already knew where the window was because earlier that night, a guy had rapped at the window and wanted to know how to get into the Florence Police Headquarters, and I told him. After escaping from the police station, Franklin paid a man he met on the street to drive him to Cincinnati. The man drove him to a mall where Franklin went to a salon and had his hair cut and dyed. The FBI contacted everybody they knew of who had been in contact with Joseph Franklin and even put surveillance on his wife's house. They now knew his real legal name, which meant he couldn't commit high-profile crimes like robbing banks. He took to donating blood to make money. The United States Marshals were called in to track Joseph Paul Franklin, as it is their function to track down fugitives wanted by federal law enforcement agencies. October 29th, Lakeland, Florida. An employee of a blood bank recognized Franklin's tattoos from a description he read, which had been distributed throughout plasma clinics across the country. He called police, who asked him to stall Franklin as much as possible. Within an hour, dozens of police surrounded the clinic, and Franklin was taken into custody. In a local county jail, Franklin confessed to several bank robberies. He admitted to the Salt Lake City murders during a phone call. He was placed on a chartered plane and flown to Salt Lake City, whereupon he was slapped with federal civil rights violation charges. The FBI agents insisted upon a chartered plane because it would be more comfortable. They also took the tack of befriending Joseph Franklin and making him comfortable. They would play into his racist beliefs, saying things they figured Franklin would enjoy hearing. Things like, "You sure fixed those," racial epithet inserted. "Out there in Salt Lake, they ought to give you a medal for cleaning up the streets." Franklin did open up about the Salt Lake City murders, but he clammed up when it came to murders he committed in other regions. Franklin befriended an inmate by the name of Robert Herrera. He respected him because Herrera was being put in double lockup for getting into a fight with a black inmate. He trusted Herrera enough to open up about crimes he committed that he hadn't admitted to the police and the FBI. Herrera betrayed him by reporting this information to authorities by bartering for a reduced sentence. The Justice Department agreed to those conditions, and the deal was made. The day after Franklin was brought into the courthouse for trial, a bailiff removed the shackles and left him alone in a room where he was to wait to confer with his lawyers. As soon as the bailiff left the room, Franklin removed the door from its hinges. Having completed this task, he headed down the hallway and searched for an escape route. He spotted an elevator. The only person who could operate it was a bailiff, who had a key. Franklin figured out how to hotwire the panel. He activated the elevator and drew it to his floor. He crawled through the elevator's emergency exit in its ceiling and crawled into the building's ventilation system. Within the hour, every bailiff and law enforcement officer on the premises surrounded the building until Franklin was discovered in the ventilation system. Once he was found, they sent him back to the courtroom without the jury having found out what happened. Joseph Paul Franklin did not fare well in court. Robert Herrera's testimony, as well as the circumstantial and forensic evidence, resulted in Franklin being convicted for civil rights violations. He was sentenced to life without parole. He had some words for the prosecutors before being taken to prison. He said to prosecutor Steve Snar, "Got any more lies about me, you little faggot?" Referring to the other prosecutor, who was an African American, he said, "You and that trained ape you've got lying for you." He also had words for the presiding judge, Bruce Jenkins. "You are nothing but an agent of the communist government, you bastard." One day while he was in prison, he was jumped by some black inmates who knew about what he had done on the outside. They stabbed him 15 times, which required a lengthy stay in the infirmary. Franklin was eventually placed in solitary confinement to protect him from other inmates. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Gerald Gordon. November 20th, 2013, Joseph Paul Franklin was executed via lethal injection. This is an interview with Joseph Franklin.
Joseph, you've been on death row now for what, 16 years?
Yeah,
I
about
guess?
16 years.
And now the execution date is drawing very near. What are your feelings with that deadline?
Well, I'm hoping to get a stay of execution and have my sentence commuted to life without parole.
What do you think your chances
That's
are?
that's what I'm shooting for now. I don't really know what to, only God knows what the chances are of it happening.
You know, you were serving consecutive life sentences for some murders when you decided to confess to the Richmond Heights
Right.
sniping and got the death sentence. Why did you decide to confess?
Well, I had a dream that told me to confess to the Richmond Heights case. And, I was kind of surprised to have a dream that would tell me that, But at the time, the guards at the federal penitentiary at Marion were planning to murder me because I assaulted one of them, threw some hot water on one of them. And I was unaware at that time that in the federal penitentiary, if you assault a prison guard, they have the right to kill you. This comes down from the top. They could literally take you and beat you to death. Any way they could think of to kill you, they have the right to kill a fellow prisoner just for assaulting a guard. I've heard it happening since then to at least one other inmate, but there have probably been dozens, maybe even hundreds of inmates murdered over there at the Marion Federal Penitentiary within the past 20, 30 years or so. And so, I was kind of in a catch-22 situation. I either could confess to this case and be on death row over here or get murdered by the guards within possibly a matter of weeks. So I chose the former to take my chances over here on death row.
Now, what prompted you to go to the synagogue that day and kill Gerald Gordon?
Well, just a misguided, just a misguided sense of right and wrong. I thought I was actually doing the right thing. I've been, indoctrinated. My mind was just all messed up after having read a whole lot of Nazi literature. Mein Kampf was the main one I read. I mean, you can go through the book from cover to cover. There's all sorts of anti-Jewish statements in there, and he doesn't even offer any proof whatsoever to back up the claims that he makes in the thing. Just nothing but one anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic statement after another. And when you continue reading that crap all the time, you eventually start to believe it. It just starts to soak into your psyche, I guess, And I was 18 when I first became involved with the American Nazi Party and started reading that book. And I was just very impressionable. I was just pretty much brainwashed by it,
Do you remember the details of that day?
Yeah, most of them. Yeah, I remember what happened.
What happened when apparently the shooting took place after the bar mitzvah was over and people were coming out?
Yeah, I really didn't have any idea what was going on there, whether it was a bar mitzvah or not. I learned that later. But I just was just waiting for people to come out during the services, and you know, when I did see some people, I began firing on them. But I was really terrified, though. I mean, I was scared while I was sitting there or kneeling there. I'd taken a large nail and drove it into a post, a telephone pole, and then put some socks on it to have something to rest the rifle on, you know, which was kind of crude. You know, I really didn't need anything to rest the rifle on. I was a very inexperienced shooter, too, at that time. I just started my mission. That was in early, you know, 77, so I really didn't know how to shoot that well. I later began practicing a whole lot over the next 3 years and became a much better shot. But at that point in time, I could barely hit the broadside of a barn. I just learned how to shoot well enough to hit somebody.
Did you realize you had hit somebody?
I couldn't really, I think I did see, I didn't actually see the guy being hit, but I saw the reaction of somebody else who was standing next to him that appeared to indicate he is looking down at somebody, you know. I didn't even stop long enough to look at him. And then I fired some other shells, several other bullets randomly in that direction, you know. And on those other bullets that I had, I knew I'd hit one guy. However, I had planned to use all the bullets and hit several others, you know, but I just couldn't do it. You know, whether it was fear or what, I mean, I know I was, you know, very afraid, you know what I mean? I don't know why, just terrified sitting there by that synagogue waiting. And, you know, instead of actually putting the crosshairs on anybody and firing again like I did with the first guy, I just fired about 4 or 5 bullets just out there, not really intended to hit anybody. And luckily they didn't hit anybody. But my plan was just to empty the gun to make it look good, I guess. Then I just dropped the gun, jumped on a bicycle that I had planned to use to escape so no one would see what type of car I was driving. Got to the car and just, you know, ditched the bicycle.
Did you feel any remorse at that point, or what did you feel after?
Well, not at that point in time. I really didn't have any other feelings in my mind other than fear. You know, just a real strong feeling of fear, you know. And then it didn't lessen after I committed the crime, because then I was afraid I would be caught by the police. I had not committed very many crimes. I was pretty inexperienced in that type of thing. I wasn't like a professional criminal. So I was just afraid, you know, mostly afraid at that time, and was just wanting to get away, you know. So,
What about now, years later? How do you feel about looking back at it?
yeah, I think it was a terrible thing to do, a terrible crime to commit against some people at a house of worship. It's just I've got no excuse for it. All I can say is I was mentally ill. I mean, it was just a really, you know, bad thing to do to somebody, you know what I mean? I regret it very much and wished I could undo it, or at least try to make amends to the people now, you know. Of course, if I get executed, I wouldn't be able to do even that, but I just feel bad about it, you know, so.
Now, you've been linked or connected somehow in different ways to like 15 to 20 killings. Is that accurate, do you think?
Well, I really don't want to go into any numbers at this point in time. I'd rather just focus on this case, if that's all right with you.
That's all right. What do you think? You think it was then the Nazi thing that fueled the hate?
Yeah, I know
You
it
hated Jews and blacks. Was that basically it?
Yeah, I would have never become anti-Jewish if I had not read Mein Kampf. That is a fact. I don't think anybody could argue with that. Plus the party publications, you know, what was published by the Nazi Party, their monthly newspaper, White Power, anti-black, anti-Jewish too. So it was basically just what I was reading and allowing into my mind without the knowledge necessary to refute any of the statements that were made. When you're 18 years old, you don't have a whole lot of knowledge, you know, and at 19, so I just did not know. I didn't know how to contradict what Hitler was saying in Mein Kampf. I didn't know other things, so I basically just accepted what he was saying as truth, you know. But I used to get a real funny feeling, though, after reading Mein Kampf. I don't know why that was. I've never had that feeling with any other book before. But after I would sit that book down and finish reading it, I would just really get this real odd feeling in my mind. You know what I mean? I don't know if it was something like some kind of psychic thing or what, but it was just a real odd feeling. And it was that book that ruined my life, messed up my life.
What started the feelings toward the blacks?
Mainly reading a whole lot of newspaper articles about black crime, you know, and they would focus on that in white power newspaper, any black on white crimes, and it just became something I was constantly obsessed with and thinking about.
Well, I didn't know if apparently Larry Flint had filed this lawsuit to try to block your execution.
Right, I heard about that.
What's that about, do you think? Although you were never tried for his shooting, I don't believe.
I was never tried for it, nope.
But you admitted that you had shot?
I admitted it, yeah.
Yeah.
And I admitted today I was wrong to try to shoot Larry Flint. It was the wrong thing to do, another terrible crime.
What's his lawsuit about? Do you
Yeah, I regret shooting Larry Flint too. Well, I haven't really, only thing I know is about an article. I mean, you probably have access to the internet and know more about it than I do.
Yeah, just that he was trying to block it because of who was supposed to administer the drugs, I believe.
Yeah.
Why would he want to block it, do you think?
He doesn't believe in the death penalty because it's administered so unfairly. He's a big supporter of the American Civil Liberties Union, and they're opposed to the death penalty. There's a whole lot of bad things about having a death penalty in a society such as this. You know what I mean? It's a lot different from biblical times, you know, when when the Lord authorized them to kill people as punishment for things. You know, for example, for adultery, people could be stoned and killed for adultery. You know, imagine what would it be like in America if they went around and killed everybody they caught committing adultery in this country. How many people you think would be? You would probably see bodies laying in the street every day. You know, the morgues would be packed. They wouldn't be able to hold all the bodies if they went by biblical law now in regards to start stoning people who committed adultery. So you can't really say we need that because that's the way it was in the Bible. Completely different society, you know. Another bad thing about this, having a death penalty in this society, is you're at a much greater advantage if you've got a lot of that guilt, money. You know what I mean? If I had a dream team like O.J. Simpson had, from the beginning, if I'd have, had the money to afford lawyers like that, I not only would not be on death row now, I would be on the streets now. As incredible as that sounds, I could have got out and be walking the streets a free man today if I'd have had that money.
Do you think you deserve to be out on the streets?
Well, what do you mean by that exactly?
I mean, do you think you would have been? Do you think you deserve to be out on the streets, or after admitting to killing this man in Richmond Heights?
Well, I think it's a terrible thing, and to tell you the truth, I really would like to be out on the streets. I'll just say that, answer your question that way. I would love to be out on the streets right now so I could make up for some of the wrong things that I did previously, It would be a good chance for me to try to cancel out, all the bad karma that I generated from committing those violent crimes, And killing people is wrong. It's violent. Any kind of violence like that is wrong. I can tell you for a fact it isn't good. And the state wants to commit violence to the inmates who've been convicted of these crimes on death row. And, two wrongs don't make a right. You know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just not a good thing. The Bible teaches that when a person has repented, and I'm talking about somebody who is sincerely repents, not like a lot of inmates who claim to be Christians just so they'll get out. I've met many like that. And most of the inmates I've met fall in that category, just basically a bunch of phonies. You know what I mean? Even a lot of Muslims the same way, a bunch of phonies. Although there are some who are sincere, and their embracing of Christianity has helped them and made them better people, but they haven't changed inside though. It hasn't been anything internal, just on the surface. The same with Muslims and various other people, or organizations, denominations. But, I've changed a whole lot over the years, so I think, I would be able to do a lot of good on the outside.
How would you describe the Joseph Franklin today compared to the one back 30 years ago?
Man, it's like a completely different person that you wouldn't even recognize. You would think it was somebody else except for the name. That was not my true self that day at that synagogue shooting at people. I would be very opposed to anybody doing like that, committing a crime like that. And it would actually make me angry to hear about somebody committing a crime that way, of that type. So I've just grown and changed so much. Sometimes I'm surprised myself at how much I've changed over the years. And I've actually made an effort to change too. I haven't just been sitting around hoping I would change. I've made a lot of effort to change. And it's just like the difference between day and night, the type of person I was then and the type of person I am now.
If you had a chance to...
Knowledge has helped out a lot. I've acquired a whole lot of knowledge since I've been locked up. Mm-hmm. Kind of focused on that. It's basically part of my religion.
So
to acquire
feel
knowledge.
like that religion has helped you then?
I already know it has. It seems to me that's pretty much the only thing that can help a person. Unless the Lord is helping you and guiding you and drawing you to Him, you ain't going to ever change. That is a fact. Most of these inmates, at least 95%, I would say, or probably more, are totally incorrigible. They never change. But there's a saying, when God saves you, He changes you, and only He can change you. So I've changed a whole lot over, the past 30 years or so,
If you had a chance to say something to the Gordon family,
yeah,
what would you say?
Well, I actually thought at one time of writing to them when I was at the St. Louis County Jail. Lee Langford came over there to talk to me one evening. That was nice of him, So we sat out there and talked through the glass of telephones like you and I are doing now. But I said, well, I've got Sheila Gordon's address because, the name was on the witness list and I was representing myself. I'd like to write to the lady and apologize to her, But he told me, don't do it. Don't write to her, So I never did. I guess he thought I would scare her, she would think I was stalking her or something like that. So I didn't write, but I really wanted to, and I've wanted to all these years to correspond with them. I was just wishing that they would reach out, somebody that's from the synagogue would contact me, and ask for an apology. But nobody did.
Yeah.
But I would apologize to her right now, tell her I'm sorry for the horrible crime that I committed and ask for her forgiveness. You know, that's what I would say to Miss Gordon now. I really feel for her.
I also, I talked with, I did not talk with Mrs. Gordon, but I talked with the young man who was having his bar mitzvah that day.
Yeah, I feel, you know, I
He
feel
was
sorry
pretty
for that.
traumatized by all
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's a horrible thing for a young lad like that.
Did
You know,
you-
when he's going through his bar mitzvah. You know, but I was so mentally ill and crazy. That's the type of thing I you know, was led into. You know, through Nazism.
Do you think you deserve to die?
Well, to tell you the truth, I actually think I do. Yeah, tell you the truth, to be quite honest with you. I cannot defend any, I cannot say no to that question.
That's a tough thing to face, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
But you think there's still a chance this will be stayed?
Yeah, well, you know, there's always a possibility, I guess, that, you know, I could get a stay
Yeah.
of execution, but people tell me I might, you know, a few people have tried to encourage me that way, so, you know, I just hope that they're right, you know. A friend of mine told me, well, she said, well, I don't think you'll get a stay. I said, what do you base that on? She said, she just has this gut feeling. And like I say, I hope she's right. That would be a good thing. Would then have a chance to make amends for a lot of the stuff I've done in whatever way I could, you know. I think that would really be a good thing, too.
Do you think that the religion that you speak of and your relationship with God has taken away the hate for Jews and blacks?
Absolutely, yeah, it sure has, yeah, you know. And I got interested in the world religions back there in the late 80s at the Federal Penitentiary at Marion. I know I've told this to a lot of people, so you probably heard it too.
That I read something where you had studied some things.
Huh? Yeah, I got into the world religions, began studying them: Hinduism, Wicca, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and various others. You know, I just became fascinated with the religion when I was at the Federal Penitentiary at Marion. And, you know, I found out that a lot of the world religions actually have a lot in common. It's amazing how much they have in common. If you study one religion and learn about it, it helps you to understand your own religion. So it's a really good thing to study other religions other than your own and not stick just with that one religion, you know. You can learn stuff from other types of religion, just like you can learn things from meeting other people from other countries and other cultures, you know. Learn a lot from them.
Okay, well, I think apparently you didn't have that kind of upbringing. You weren't introduced to religion as a child. Doesn't sound like.
I actually had, you know, was involved in religion quite a bit when I was a kid, you know, and really the only person in my family who was, you know. And when I was 15, I became involved with Herbert W. Armstrong's Worldwide Church of God, headquartered in Pasadena, California. Him and his son, Garner Ted Armstrong, were the leaders of the church. Mm-hmm. You might remember them from the 60s. They had a radio broadcast from coast to coast, off the coast of England. You know, they had the pirate stations there because they wouldn't allow anything but the BBC in England. But they taught a form of British Israelism, and I used to actually observe the Sabbath and all the holy days and stuff like that, and, you know, would not eat pork and other unclean meats even when I was a teenager. You know, we were given a calendar, a Hebrew calendar with all the names of the months, you know, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Ab, Elul, and all the names of the months of the year written in Hebrew, you know, and I memorized them at that time. So I had, you know, I was more into religion when I was growing up than most inmates are now. You know what I mean? Most of them had never darkened the door of a church before.
Yeah.
You know, so, but I went astray, and that's how I wound up here. You know, it was my punishment from the Lord.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
It's been nice talking to you, Mr. O'Neill.
And
You're Tom O'Neill?
yes,
Okay. One of the gentlemen who works here recognized you and told me your name before I got up here.
yeah.
Yeah.
We're with Fox too. So
Yes,
appreciate you talking with us.
it's not a
And,
problem.
Is there anything else that you would like to say to me or anyone else?
Well, Larry Flint for president. Yeah. Tell you the truth, I mean, I liked what he said about me, you know, trying to stop my execution, you know. But really, I really think, seriously, I've thought about this, you know, Larry is pretty much interested in politics, you know. I think he would make a better president of the United States than Obama and a lot of the politicians in Washington today. You know, I don't think he would allow Gitmo to stay open. He would close that immediately with an executive order. He wouldn't be killing innocent men, women, and children with drones over there in Pakistan like Obama's doing now. You know, I think he would you know, believe it or not, I think Larry Flint would make a great president of the United States.
Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.